Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar titled No War with Iran. My name is Nancy Rice, and I'm a member of VPAC, the Vermont Peace Anti-War Coalition. We're co-sponsoring this webinar with the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation, VCPL. We're sponsoring this program tonight because we wanted to learn more about why there seems to be such antagonism by our government toward Iran. I personally think of Iranians as having families they care about, just like we do here. So why is there such apparent animosity by our government toward the country of Iran? It seems to me if people treated others like they themselves would like to be treated, that would go a long way toward having a peaceful world. So who or what is standing in the way of the peaceful world we all want? Tonight's program is an attempt to better understand that question. So we've invited Professor Navid Farnia. He is speaking to us from Detroit and is the author of National Liberation in an Imperialist World. Now let's turn our attention to Henry Nichols of VPAC and VCPL. He will tell us more about these two organizations and will introduce Professor Farnia, who will give his presentation for about half an hour, and then we'll answer questions for the rest of the time.
Thanks, Nancy.
Mhm.
I'm Henry. I'm in Thetford, Vermont. I think a lot of us are in Vermont, maybe all of us. Vermont Peace Anti-War Coalition started about 2 years ago, maybe a little more. And some of our initial work, it was always based in anti-imperialism and anti-war. Some of our initial work was seeing that a lot of the progressives in Vermont were not addressing the dangers of the Ukraine war, and there was, support even from a lot of our progressives here and so-called progressive politicians who were supporting that, and so we've done some actions trying to educate about that and pressure to sending offensive weapons. We have joined a lot with VCPL, the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation, during the more active phase of this long-term genocide. And I will let Wafiq speak a bit more about VCPL in a second. But first, I just wanted to welcome Navid. And Navid is the author, as Nancy said, of National Liberation in an Imperialist World. It's an upcoming book. The subtitle is Race, Counter-Revolution, and the United States. And he's a professor in the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State University. And he's looked at U.S. repression of many liberation movements, from the Black Panthers to the ongoing struggle for liberation in Cuba, and U.S. repression and targeting of Iran. And so I think there's a really solid basis for understanding the broader picture, and we hope to get some of the specifics also. With that, Wafiq, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ammo. Thank you. Thank you. My name is Wafiq. I'm a member of the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation. And thank you, everybody. And I'm very interested to listen to Professor Navid about Iran, because all questions are connected. The coalition the question of Palestine and working as solidarity for the Palestinian people goes years and years ago. So I was part of Vermont for Justice in Palestine before we started with other parties and organizations, about 27 of them, building this coalition post-October 7. To tell you straightforward what is the strategy, the simple strategy for the coalition and what's the goal, is very simple. We are not hiding our agenda. We are clear about our purpose and goals. We want the question of Palestine to become local, a Vermont question. And when I say that the question of Palestine to become part of the American narrative, that they should understand that the American continuous military aid to Israel and keeping that colonial project going is hurting other people, it's killing our people. And this is the whole purpose. Our coalition accomplished a lot. Of course, majority of our action are mobilization of our forces and reaction. Like today, many of our parties organized the rally on St. Albans in front of the prison because of Mohsen, a Vermont resident who lived in Vermont for about 7 years and in the United States about 10 years. And the United States picked him up when they invited him to apply for citizenship, invited him and they trapped him and they took him to jail. They tried to fly him out of Vermont, but because of the lateness of the flight, his lawyer succeeded to ask the Judge Session to freeze his moving out of the state and to keep him here. So he's now on a jail in Swanton. With all this happening now, that the government weaponizing anti-Semitism to call anybody, whatever they're going to say about Palestine is anti-Semitic. If it is Mohsen or Rumaiza, the Turkish a student in Tufts University who were here on F1 visa, or hundreds and hundreds, and by today it's more thousands. They lost their visas here, and many of them, they are waiting deportation, some of them with no hearing. The coalition was concentrating in one far away from mobilization. It is organizing. We went into the street, and Thetford was one of the first victory on apartheid-free campaign, that the public, instead of thinking that the American public are anti-Palestinian automatically, we insisted, no, we want to hear from the American public directly. And we discovered, if you educate the American public about the question of Palestine, and the Israeli genocide and apartheid, the American public are fair, and they're going to stand with the Palestinian in a fair position. And this is what happened on 5 municipalities on March 4th, when we introduced apartheid-free community to the public. But with all these activities and weaponizing more and more of anti-Semitism, and using the First Amendment rights by silencing the Palestinian or pro-Palestinians or Muslim or Arabs when they stand with the Palestinian justice or Palestinian human rights, we found the American government strangely using the first or eroding the First Amendment rights. It's disappearing completely when it comes to the question of Palestine. And this is not danger to our activists and solidarity, but it is danger to the American public and to you, because they're going to come after you after they came after Palestinians. Those people who are in jail and facing deportation, like Rumaiza, like Mahmoud, like today Mohsen, are simple. They are excellent students. They are fantastic human beings. They are peaceful people. But the American government are telling us, if we do that to peaceful people, imagine to the people who are striking every day, organizing every day, what will happen to them. Last thing I'm going to say before I listen to Professor Navid, The United States of America, for the longest time, they used to use the First Amendment rights or the right to speech as a weapon on third world countries, saying you don't have a freedom, especially in Iran during the Green Revolutions and the woman march after the death of women activists. They used to use the human rights and the equal rights and weaponize it against the country who don't listen to the United States. But we are discovering more and more that because the United States, the American government and Israel are using the battle on the ground in the Middle East, they weaponize the freedom of speech. They are ready to lose the battle here, the First Amendment rights on the expense, because they are losing the battle in the ground over there. It's not a democracy. You cannot say Israel is the only democracy on the Middle East when they are actually an apartheid state, have two sets of laws, one for the Palestinians and one for the Jews. We cannot say United States have First Amendment rights. When it comes to the Palestinian Solidarity Group, we are not allowed to use it. And if we used it, we're going to end up on jail or we're going to face deportation. They weaponize that against the Iranian, against many countries that they don't agree with the American imperialist and Israeli colonialism. And for now, I would love to listen to Professor Navid, and thank you.
Thank you, Amo. So yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that we are in the midst of a new McCarthyism, and the previous McCarthyism, the biggest crime was that it enabled genocide and colonialism and suppressed oppression to our descent from that. And the biggest crimes of the 50s were not the domestic McCarthyism, but the 3 million killed in Korea, the million in Indonesia, and coups all over, including in Iran. So, Navid, thank you for being here, and yeah, I'm excited to learn more. And we'll have questions at the end.
Okay. Thank you so much, Henry. First of all, I just want to say, Henry, feel free if I'm going over on time to interrupt me, and I'll we'll figure it out. But I just want to say thank you to the Vermont Peace Anti-War Coalition and also the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation for inviting me to speak. A special thanks to Henry, along with Jill and Crystal, for making this event happen. I've been asked to address the following questions. Why have the imperial powers been fixated on Iran for so long? How much of this has to do with Iran's support for the axis of resistance? How much of it is about blocking Iran and Palestine's ability to bridge liberation movements from different parts of the world? And how much is it about destroying their connection to even non-revolutionary multi-polarity inclined countries? And so to answer these questions, I'm going to divide my presentation into two parts. The first part is going to be historical, and it's going to probably be the lion's share of this 30 minutes. And then the second part, though, is going to be geopolitical, getting into the analysis of the current moment, which will sort of filter into the Q&A. And I think Henry's going to ask me some questions about that in particular. But I'll start with the historical. It's important to go historical because we need to understand why, for example, in order to understand why Iran has been targeted by imperial powers, we have to go back really to the 1950s to get a sense of what has been going on and what these imperial powers have been doing with respect to Iran. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide an episodic analysis of the history, analyze particular events dating from the 50s to the 70s and 80s to the 21st century, and from that I'll develop through lines of all these events and bring it all together. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is as Henry mentioned, actually, the U.S. orchestrated coup against Iran in 1953, which was in response to Iran's efforts to nationalize its oil industry. Okay, Now, the story of U.S. imperialism in Iran largely begins with the U.S. and British orchestrated coup against Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953. This starts with really, again, oil nationalization. So in 1951, a strike by oil workers in Iran compelled the Iranian government to effect the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. Now, to this point, Iran's oil was under the control of Great Britain under a state-private collaboration between the British government and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or the AIOC, which was a British company. Now, for its part, the AIOC's operations in Iran accounted for 75% of the company's overall profits, world profits, okay? And it's because Iran was the world's second largest crude oil exporter after Venezuela. Now, Iran's decision to nationalize the oil industry led the British to conspire toward Mossadegh's ouster, because Mossadegh was the person who really championed oil nationalization and was the leader when this nationalization process was happening. And this is what the British Secretary of State at the time said, a man by the name of Philip Noel Baker. He explained, quote, "The importance of Persian oil to the economy and defense of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth is so great that we cannot afford to take the smallest chance of labor troubles or social unrest, the more so since the company, the AIOC, are making such large profits and have such large reserves," end quote. So this leads into the coup. The British solicited the U.S.'s support for a planned coup, but the U.S. had already determined that it could not allow Iran to exercise economic sovereignty as it had with the oil nationalization decision. So when the British approached the United States was already sort of employing machinations to undermine Iran. A March 1951 policy proposal drafted by the National Security Council outlined that the United States should, quote, "be prepared to undertake special political operations to effect Iranian alignment with the West. The loss of Iran's oil would seriously affect Western economic and military interests, particularly as regards to the level of industrial activity in Western Europe." Okay, so you can see from these quotes that Iran's oil was a national security sort of matter with respect to Europe. Bear that in mind. Now, the entire operation of the coup also proved to be an opportunity for the United States to exercise its power in the West Asia region at an unprecedented level to that point. Given the Cold War context, this was particularly important for the United States. So as such, the operation quickly became a US-led endeavor. The coup was executed in August of 1953, and in fact, it almost failed. I won't get into the intricate dynamics of that, but it did eventually end up succeeding. And after the coup, the United States and the British reached an oil settlement with the post-coup government that gave favorable terms to the imperial powers and entrenched the United States in Iran's oil industry. The Western powers also placed their firm backing behind the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who continued to rule the country for another 26 years after 1953. So in short, the coup again entrenched the U.S. and Iranian affairs for the first time, and it established the conditions by which successive U.S. presidencies could dictate to Iran, particularly since the Shah's authoritarian government became politically, economically, and militarily dependent on the United States in the aftermath. This relationship lasted for about 26 years, as I said, and ended with the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So now I'm going to fast forward to late 1970s. Now, the Iranian Revolution was fundamentally an anti-imperialist revolution. It ousted the US-backed Shah once and for all, and thereby severed all relations between the United States and Iran. By 1977, the Shah had alienated practically every sector of Iranian society, including the urban working class, the peasantry, the middle class, the rural landowners, the clergy, and the intelligentsia. Okay? These elements essentially activated in 1977 and engaged in various forms of nonviolent resistance, to which the Shah's government responded with violent repression. The resistance included the September 1978 general strike that was observed all across the country, along with a massive protest of millions of people that December 1978, calling for the establishment of an Islamic Republic. Along with, they also demanded the return of the exiled Ayatollah Khomeini to the country, along with the expulsion of imperial powers. Okay? They also demanded the enforcement of social justice in service of the oppressed peoples of the country. Now, all of this culminated in the Shah leaving the country by January of 1979. Khomeini returned on February 1st of 79, and the revolutionaries ousted the last vestiges of the ruling government by February 11th of 1979. Okay, so it led to the eventual establishment of the Islamic Republic, with all these events coming together. These events also halted the US's overwhelming influence on Iranian affairs and its violations against Iranian self-determination, all of which had been welcomed by the Shah and facilitated by him. The final straw that marked the complete severing of US-Iran ties was the so-called hostage crisis, in which 400 Iranian university students climbed the walls of the US embassy and held embassy officials as captives for 444 days. The students who carried out this act were convinced that the CIA was using the embassy as the headquarters to launch another coup. And the reason for this is because this is exactly what had happened in 1953. The coup in 53 was essentially launched out of and executed from the US embassy. Okay. Now, I should also note that the students who carried out this act did end up releasing Black and most of the women captives as a symbol of solidarity with oppressed groups in the United States and around the world. Okay. This entire situation, though, led the United States to sever diplomatic relations with Iran in April of 1980. Okay. This brings me to the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted from 1980 to 1988, was a major test for the viability of the Islamic Republic and, in fact, accelerated the consolidation of the revolution. It was during the war that the Iranian militias were solidified into a full-fledged force known as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. You all may have heard of the IRGC. The IRGC came to number 120,000 troops, and it also controlled a volunteer force called the Basij, which is in English is called the Mobilization of the Oppressed, which had another 200,000 troops. This was all in addition to the regular army, which numbered almost 400,000 troops at the time. Now, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States and Iraq reestablished relations. Okay, the relations between the U.S. and Iraq had been previously frayed, but they reestablished relations during the war. Washington subsequently provided substantial military support to the Iraqis, including military equipment, intelligence, and training. In fact, CIA files indicate that the United States helped Iraq to use chemical weapons during the war. The New York Times reported that the U.S. shipped 7 strains of anthrax to Iraq from 1978 to 1988, and an official army letter noted that the U.S. had been training Iraqi military officers in the use of chemical and biological weapons. Now, on the other hand, the United States also covertly provided weapons to Iran, and the proceeds, the profits from which those weapons that they got from those weapons were then reallocated to Nicaragua to help the Contras in their war against Nicaragua's revolutionary government, right? So you all may, I'm sure, remember and may know of the Iran-Contra affair. So in this respect, the Reagan government was playing both sides in the Iran-Iraq war, which would destabilize both countries and thereby reinforce its own position in the region by strengthening the Zionist regime, the Israelis, and the Gulf countries, the US's major allies in the region. All of these machinations, from Iran and Iraq to Nicaragua, had a counter-revolutionary purpose. In other words, they aimed to destabilize states that had taken or could take an anti-imperialist position while simultaneously stabilizing the US's allies. Okay. Now, from here, I want to fast forward to the so-called War on Terror. Okay. As I'm sure everyone here knows, the George W. Bush government classified Iran, along with Iraq and North Korea, as collectively part of the so-called Axis of Terror. As we all know, this included the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq. Okay, so again, Iraq enters the picture. The occupation toppled the Saddam Hussein government, and the occupation continues to remain in Iraq to this day, albeit at a much smaller level. Okay, this includes thousands of troops, estimated currently at around 2,500 troops in Iraq and multiple bases. The occupation also gave rise to ISIS, an organization which views Iran as a primary enemy. Now, all this to say, aside from overthrowing the Iraqi government and destroying the Iraqi state, the US war in Iraq had the secondary purpose of encircling and thereby destabilizing Iran. And at this point, I do want to share my screen to show a map, share a map with you all. 1 second. Okay, can you all see this map?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Now, around 55,000, there are still around 55,000 known U.S. troops in West Asia currently. Okay, and you can see, from this map that, all these bases essentially encircle Iran. Okay, Iran is encircled, which in effect poses a national security threat to Iran. Any other country in the world would interpret the presence of any enemy bases surrounding it as hostile. Okay. All of this brings me to the JCPOA agreement in 2015, the nuclear deal. Okay. The JCPOA standing for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Now, the Obama government's attempts to normalize relations with Iran in the form of JCPOA not only aimed to halt Iran's nuclear development, but it also entailed opening Iran to foreign economic interests. One of the understated and now forgotten aspects of the nuclear deal was the economic opportunity that it presented for foreign investment in Iran. The following is from a Press TV article in September of 2015. Quote, "International companies are anxiously looking to Iran's introduction of new oil projects and the terms under which the oil-rich country would award them for development," end quote. So this fact, now buried in the depths of history, speaks to the historical designs that Western powers have had for Iran, particularly with respect to the country's oil resources. Okay? This is nothing new. As we know, this story also pertains to countries like Venezuela, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Russia, Niger, and every other resource-rich country. It also speaks to why the current Trump government seems desperate to secure a deal with the Zelensky government for Ukraine's minerals, rare earth minerals. Okay? But Trump's government during his first term took a different path with Iran in the nuclear deal. Okay, and I'll try to explain later on the differences between the first and second Trump governments in here in a bit. But for now, I want to focus on his first term. Now, the 2016 Trump campaign and his subsequent administration attacked JCPOA at every turn and threatened to withdraw from the nuclear agreement if Iran did not make major concessions which were not outlined in the agreement. So when Iran predictably refused this unfavorable changing of the terms, the United States under Trump abandoned the JCPOA agreement, though Washington, I should clearly note, still worked hard to influence the agreement from the outside. Okay, all of this led to the maximum pressure campaign. And I'll stop sharing for a moment, and I'll share again later. Okay. So maximum pressure. Now, the Trump government instituted a maximum pressure campaign against Iran using sanctions in order to destabilize the Iranian government. These sanctions were and are intentionally designed to reach Iran's general population. This includes the prevention of access to medications for everyday people. It includes the causing of economic inflation, which again hits everyday people the most, okay, along with other punitive measures. These sanctions are also designed to prevent any possibility, okay, and also the maximum pressure campaign in general are designed to prevent any possibility for Iran to participate in the Western-controlled international financial system. Now, in April of 2020, for instance, Washington pressured the International Monetary Fund to decline Iran's request for a loan to combat COVID-19. And I use the term pressure lightly here since it understates the U.S.'s influence with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Iran was well known to be the hardest hit country in the region and one of the most urgent situations in the world at the time. Now, as an aside, we should bear in mind that the IMF has played a central role in neoliberal globalization in the last few decades. It has a long history of providing loans to third world countries, global south countries, and the terms of those loans require governments to implement structural adjustment programs that include encouraging foreign investment and slashing public spending on education, healthcare, and welfare, for instance. Okay, so in a rare instance, a rare case in which the IMF did not require neoliberal economic reforms as a stipulation for loan approval, which was during the COVID-19 pandemic, Washington played a central role in denying such needed funds to Iran. Trump government officials argued at the time that if Iran were allowed to access IMF funds, Tehran would divert those funds to help its economy, quote, finance militants in the Middle East rather than on containing the pandemic, end quote. Now, in April of 2019, the previous year, Washington had designated Iran's IRGC as a terrorist organization. This was the first time in history that the US government had named part of another government as a terrorist organization. Okay? Trump said at the time that the designation would, quote, significantly expand the scope and scale of our maximum pressure on the Iranian regime, end quote. In its public statement about the designation, the State Department singled out the Quds Force, a unit of the IRGC that was led by Qasem Soleimani. Now, a few months later, in October of 2019, the Iranians reported that they had foiled a plot by Israel and the Arab countries to assassinate Soleimani. Okay? This was a few months before the US actually successfully carried out the assassination in early January of 2020. Some of you may remember that. Okay? It almost led to a war. So all evidence points to the conclusion that the assassination of Soleimani was months in the making and marked an escalation of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. The previous alleged assassination attempt against Soleimani reinforces all this. Okay? The US and the Zionists have shown that the strategy of assassination is part and parcel of the larger hybrid war against Iran. And also, I would say, the larger axis of resistance as well. Now, for its part, the Biden government, despite claiming during the 2020 presidential campaign that the United States would go back to the negotiating table with Iran and the other JCPOA signatories, the Biden government never actually reversed Trump's policy and, in fact, further intensified maximum pressure sanctions. Okay. Now, this should not have come as a surprise, as Biden's Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, was a staunch interventionist who supported, for example, the U.S. military invasion of Libya, which decimated the country. He also included the partition of Iraq during the Iraq War. And most obviously and most recently, he was sort of perhaps the main architect from Washington of the genocidal war on Gaza. Okay. Now, I want to bring this all to the post-October 7th moment, okay? Because October 7th, 2023, upended the existing regional dynamics. The U.S. Zionist provocations against Iran greatly intensified in the ensuing months after October of 2023. Those provocations have included assassinations against political and military leaders, along with scientists, and include continuing the crippling sanctions regime. In April of 2024, moreover, the Zionists bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria. The attack violated the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which renders diplomatic premises immune to such attacks. Okay? And then in July of 2024, the Zionists assassinated the Palestinian liberation leader Ismail Haniyeh on Iranian soil, Tehran. Now, Iran, of course, responded to the U.S. Zionist aggressions with Operation True Promise in April, and then True Promise 2 in October, the latter of which significantly damaged Zionist military bases. Okay. So this brings me to the present moment and all the through lines. I want to sort of really establish the through lines in all the events that I've discussed, from the 53 coup to post-October 7th. So what are the through lines in all this history? Okay. Why is Iran of particular interest to the United States? First, Iran's resource-rich nature has made it a target of imperialist powers in ways that bear great similarities to, again, other resource-rich countries. We therefore should not be surprised that the United States has either actively ravaged Iran or encircled it, eager to prey upon any perceived weakness for the past 8 decades. But second, and perhaps more directly pertinent for our discussion, is Iran's anti-imperialist defiance since the 1979 revolution. Anti-imperialism is not simply abstract in nature. It's not rhetorical, okay? It has material consequences that threaten U.S. and Zionist interests in the region. In fact, the Zionists have determined that Iran's anti-imperialism poses an existential threat to Israel. This brings me to perhaps an even more pressing question that I referenced earlier, which is, why has the current Trump government seemingly proven more willing to engage Iran in negotiations than during this first term? I argue that the post-October 7th reality has exposed the U.S.'s inability to maintain full spectrum dominance in the world, let alone the West Asia region. Okay, there are reports, for example, that the United States is unable to deter Yemen in the latter's uncompromising support for Palestine. Okay, the U.S. can kill Yemeni civilians, but has placed little more than a dent in the Yemeni resistance capabilities. The most recent report, I believe from today or yesterday, was that the United States has depleted 3% of its Tomahawk missile stockpile in its bombing campaign against Yemen. Okay, and it hasn't done anything again to deter Yemen's support for Palestine. And now there are reports that increasingly the Saudis and the UAE are re-engaging against Yemen because they had sort of engaged in a 10-year war against Yemen previously, starting in 2015, that was U.S. backed, but they were unable to oust the revolutionary movement that came to power in Yemen during these last 9-10 years. Okay, so Iran, with all the issues that Yemen has posed to the United States, Iran would prove an exponentially greater challenge in this respect. These realities force Washington to the negotiating table. And in this, though we'll see what comes of the negotiations. Okay, we'll see if the negotiations prove fruitful. So now I want to shift gears and sort of provide a more geopolitical analysis of both Iran's role in the region and the world. And how am I on time, Henry? Am I okay? Or?
You're good, yeah, and yeah, I think we've all been following like the onslaught on the whole axis of resistance from Yemen to Syria to Lebanon, and I worry not only for the people there, but also for the consequences of where the U.S. is headed, that it could be trying to eliminate like secondary deterrence by Iran. And in Syria especially, it seems like that's succeeded pretty well in a frightening way. And so there's that. And then a lot of us also have been following, some of us here are from the PSL and following, but many of us are following the multipolar world for its faults and its things that are worthy of praise. So yeah, I wonder how that fits, both of those things fit into the reasons for the U.S. continuing to target Iran, and also whether the U.S. feels that it can actually get away with a full-on war.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with the first part, right? And so in terms of the acts of resistance, first of all, let's be clear, the acts of resistance consist of Iran, Yemen, the resistance movements in Lebanon and Iraq, and of course, Palestine. And also, as you mentioned, Henry, also formerly Syria before the coup in last December. Okay. First of all, we have to be clear, and I think that the resistance, I think is clear on this, that U.S. imperialism is intrinsically tied to Zionism. And Zionism's collapse will not only lead to the liberation of Palestine, but also, in fact, will sort of lead to the decline of U.S. imperialism in the region. So in that respect, that's one way that U.S. imperialism, and Zionism are sort of, what the acts of resistance has sort of identified as that relationship. Second of all, the other acts of resistance countries, aside from Palestine, of course, have attained an incomplete liberation. And in fact, their liberation, they've identified, I would argue, as being meaningless without the liberation of Palestine. And you can see that, right? Because Zionism has been a major destabilizing force in the region, right? And that reality is blatantly clear in the post-October 7th moment. The Zionists have bombed all of the acts of resistance countries, right? So in this respect, the acts of resistance, if you all like, are history buffs, like the acts of resistance is not so different, for example, from the frontline states of Southern Africa, which those countries were countries that materially supported South Africa's liberation struggle against the apartheid regime during the 1970s and 1980s, with crucial support from Cuba as well, right? So, the axis of resistance is central to, undermining the Zionist-U.S. relationship, and has shown that really, you cannot defeat U.S. imperialism in the region without directly combating Zionism and defeating Zionism itself, right? So in that respect, we have to understand, Yemen right now is fighting a bombing campaign against, the United States. Now it's dealing once again with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, right? All of these countries basically doing their work, their dirty work in the service of Israel, right? But parts of Yemen remain occupied by foreign-backed forces, right, that don't have any popular support. Syria has been completely partitioned. Syria was occupied before the coup last December, but has been completely partitioned since then, right? The Israelis have occupied more and more territory in the southern part of Syria, right? The Iraqis, right? They've been fighting against an occupation for the last, 22 years, right? The U.S. troops still occupied, like there are still military bases there. And so you have the emergence over the last 10 years or so of what are called the popular mobilization forces that have resisted foreign incursions, right? And the popular mobilization forces are the forces that are part of the axis of resistance in Iraq. Lebanon is the same thing, right? Having to deal with both internal and external predations by the U.S. and the Zionists. And, Lebanon, as you all know, has been bombed extensively and continues to be bombed by the Zionists, right? So all these countries, aligned with Iran, have made it clear that their position in support of Palestine is, yes, a moral and humanitarian position, right? And they put that at the forefront. But it's also, we need to be clear that it's also about, Iranians being able to live free without like the threat of being bombed, right? Or just being sanctioned, or the Lebanese people being able to live without being bombed every day, right? And so that's why it's important to really hit on the relationship between Zionism and the United States in the region, and particularly Zionism and the U.S. bases in the region, right? So when the Israelis hit Iran in October of last year, they launched some of their flights from a U.S. military base in Iraq, occupied Iraq, right? So these relationships are important to identify both on the side of the axis of resistance and on the side of the Zionist imperialist alliance.
Yeah, so we have about 25, 30 minutes left. And so I guess I have one more question, and then we'll get to everybody else's. And I'm just wondering, I guess everybody's probably wondering that if you look at the reality and the failure of Israeli air defenses, and it would be crazy for the U.S. to launch up a direct war with Iran. And do you have any words on your perspective on whether the U.S. has some sanity or not?
I would say yes. I think that they have been compelled. The United States, Washington has been compelled to come to the negotiating table, particularly because the Trump government has been sobered by the reality of their lack of success in Yemen. You know, if you can't hit the underground bases in Yemen, right? Like Iran is far more fortified than Yemen. So in that respect, and there's been news stories that have come out over the last week or two about how the United States has had to divert resources from the Pacific region to attack Yemen, which means that it's like digging into a stockpile in the Pacific where it's trying to combat China, right? So in that respect, and if you all remember, China was like the initial sort of target for the first Trump government, and I would say remains the main target to this day. But all of what's happening in West Asia has weakened the United States. Yemen has established, like, they have not been able to establish deterrence with Yemen, and with Iran sort of hanging in the background, like not even having sort of really activated militarily in a direct sense, right? It doesn't bode well for the United States to wage war in the region. Not to mention all of this, right? The fact that the people of the United States are war weary, right? 2 decades of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for what, right? That didn't accomplish anything other than destabilizing those countries and proliferating, both on the one hand, reactionary right-wing forces throughout the region that were sort of, I would argue, unleashed by the U.S. and the Zionists. But on the other hand, those wars also strengthened Iran's position in the region, right? So in that respect, U.S. military action has not, has been unsuccessful at weakening Iran in the last 20 some years, right? So I think the material conditions, the material realities force Washington to be sober in their analysis of the prospect of a war with Iran. Now, that said, the Israelis clearly want a war. That much is very clear. And the reason why, I argue, is that the longer this goes on, the longer that the Palestinian resistance is able to endure, the longer that the axis of resistance in general is able to endure, right? The prospects for the Zionist regime become less and less feasible, right? The ambitions, the objectives, the very reality of Zionism becomes less and less feasible, right? People have talked about, like, for example, particularly after the fall of Syria, people talked about the death of the axis of resistance and these kinds of things, right? Certainly, the axis of resistance was weakened after the fall of Syria. And really, we saw, like, the resistance in Lebanon was weakened with the assassinations and with the pager attack and all that, right? But we can't be operating in absolute terms. In other words, yes, the axis of resistance has been weakened, right? But also, on the other hand, the Zionist regime has been weakened, I would say, far more, right? And so the relative balance of power is far more favorable to the resistance than it has ever been in the past 8, 9 decades, right? And that is a reality that even people on the left, I feel, in the United States have failed to take into account, right? I think Washington seems like the government seems to be a little bit more sober in their analysis of that reality, right? But for the Israelis, their idea is to strike now because the longer this goes, the weaker they become, right? The longer, for example, the blockade lasts in the Red Sea, the more destabilized the Israeli economy becomes, right? And it's that is unsuitable for a settler colonial regime, right? The longer that the Palestinian resistance endures in Gaza and the West Bank, right, the more demoralized the Israeli military forces become. And in fact, we're seeing right now that Israeli reserve soldiers and even active soldiers are signing petitions to bring the captives back home, even if that means a permanent ceasefire, right? So already the morale in Israel is very low, right? In occupied Palestine by Israelis is very low. So, what is it to say in like a year, 2 years, so on and so forth, right? That's why I believe that Zionism is facing an irreconcilable contradiction, right? It's either like it's push all the chips forward now in hopes of destroying Iran and therefore the axis of resistance, which I don't think would be successful, or it's to be patient. And the patience, I think, is favorable to the resistance, and that is because patience has been favorable to guerrilla resistance movements historically around the world, right? The Vietnamese, the Algerians, right? The South Africans, the Cubans, so on and so forth. And I think Palestine is no different. I do have a few words about multipolarity. Do you want me to talk about that or?
Sure, yeah, and I was just gonna say that that's all very helpful, and I think it really emphasizes the importance of centering what our free speech is about, which is about the liberation of Palestine. And free speech in America is great, but if the some of the keys to avoiding war in the US are actually the war weariness of US population and the fact that the US population is turning against being willing to do anything for Israel,
Mhm.
then our speech is key, not for speech itself, but for the world and for Palestine and for Iran even. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so
I
yeah,
would say a couple things.
I wonder if we
Um,
could get some questions, but maybe we have about 5 minutes about multipolarity and Iran's role. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, so I think it's important to point out that like we're witnessing what right now in the 2020s, the resurgence of national liberation struggles around the world, right? Obviously, we've seen it in Palestine. We're seeing it in Palestine, in West Asia. We've also seen it in West Africa. I don't know how many of you know much about the Alliance of Sahel States in West Africa, but that alliance is a reflection of it's an anti-imperialist alliance that is designed, these countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, have committed themselves to building their countries through nationalizing their resources and ousting foreign influence from their countries, right? Now, the last time we witnessed such a sort of resurgence of national liberation, such a sort of strong wave of national liberation was during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, during the Cold War, right? And it's not a coincidence that the last time we had a multipolar world, we also had the emergence of national liberation struggles. At that time, struggles directly against colonialism in Africa, Asia, and imperialism in Latin America, right? So the resurgence of national liberation in the 2020s is directly also related to multipolarity, right? In the 50s and 60s, right, as these countries were fighting for their independence from the European empires, the fear was that if they were to wage armed struggle and win their independence from Britain and France, for example, through armed struggle, they would sever all ties with the West and join the Soviet bloc, right? And that was the greatest fear. So the British, the French, and these other empires decided to give a lot of their countries independence while maintaining economic ties and maintaining like the sort of previous existing colonial relations with the facade of political sovereignty, right? So that sort of became neo-colonialism, right? Um, but the multipolar world at the time compelled the sort of independence of these countries. Now we have multipolarity again, the reemergence of multipolarity, and it's once again we're seeing these countries that have more breathing room than they had in the past 40 years, right? So they're now once again reasserting their sovereignty, reasserting their self-determination. In the case of Palestine, directly once again re-engaging in the armed struggle for liberation, right? So multipolarity serves the purposes of national liberation, and I would also argue that national liberation advances multipolarity because it weakens the empires that preside over these colonized and neo-colonized countries, right? So I think it's very, very important to keep that in mind. Regardless of what you think, for example, of the Russian government or the Chinese government, the fact that there are these counterpoles to the United States provides global South countries with the ability to have some breathing room in order to sort of negotiate and make deals with those who they find more beneficial to make deals with, right? Which is precisely what's happened in, for example, West African countries. They've gone away from the French and the United States, and they've sort of strengthened their bonds and relations with Iran, but particularly China and Russia. So hopefully that addresses the multipolarity piece.
Totally. And it's another reason why Iran is in the crosshairs, and
Yes.
hopefully we can continue to argue that a multipolar world is better for all of us, because that same era in the 50s, 60s, and 70s was the best era for the welfare state in the US,
Yes.
because there was competition in our system as well.
Yes.
So, um, so yeah, I wonder if we can get some questions. And thank you so much. That was really, I think, of covered so many aspects that it's rare to hear all of it put together. So thank you.
Absolutely.
So, oh, I see Jerome. Jerome, do you have a question? Let's see. I think
Um,
everybody can unmute at this point. Yeah.
I I was wondering when you were mentioning all of the people at the present moment in the Middle East who are put into these various very uh, difficult circumstances of breakup in relation to what you were saying before about Syria. You didn't mention the Kurds, and I was wondering what you might be able to tell us about what is happening there. And I have not received a lot of information about them in this present time. Uh, so
Yeah.
do, can you tell us where they are in the mix? Because they are usually the losers in these negotiative situations ever since Churchill, etc., and the invasion, the original invasions, at that point that he was part of.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. The Kurds, particularly the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which comprise the armed wing of the Kurdish movement in Syria, have struck a deal with the post-coup government, the HTS, the
Oh,
rebranded Al-Qaeda government, right? So they struck a deal with the government. The sort of terms of the deal are to be that the SDF is going to be integrated into the general Syrian state, and specifically the Syrian military. But there are also wranglings about like, what's the government going to look like? Is it going to be actually representative? Is it going to be is it just going to be an HTS government, or is it going to be reflected of HTS and the SDF and other uh, you know uh, anti Assad forces in Syria. But the I would to generalize to zoom out and like to think about all of Syria for a moment. The post-coup reality in Syria has been a catastrophe. I'm sure all of you have heard about the massacres that occurred last month on the coast of Syria and the Mediterranean of Alawites, Christians. Um, this kind of repression, this violent repression continues, right? And the Israelis continue to occupy more and more territory in the south, and the HTS government has done nothing to stop that, right? They've done nothing to sort of challenge the Israelis. All the meanwhile, Iran has sort of exited the picture from Syria, but the HTS continually talks about we Syria have to make sure to curb Iranian influence in this country while being occupied by the Israelis, right? While being continuing to be occupied by the United States in the north, right? And also by the Turks as well, the Turks, right? So it's
yeah.
that reality is very messy and unfortunate. Um, I'm not as doomsday about Syria as some other folks have been, because I think there are sort of contradictions within Syria that will emerge that will be favorable to the resistance. But for the Syrian people, it's been a tragedy. It's been an absolute catastrophe. And like one colleague, an Arab colleague, has referred to it as a true extension of the Nakba. So that's how bad people see it.
Yes.
Thank you both. Anyone else with questions? Nick.
Brittany.
Nick or Brittany, are you muted or unmuted?
Hi. Hey, Professor. Thank you for your highly elucidating talk. One thing I was hoping maybe you could touch on is I feel like there's a misnomer surrounding the term axis of resistance. In the West, we get this kind of narrative that it's almost like a centralized like committee that meets, kind of conspires in the shadows. And I think it feeds a really poor narrative, especially in terms of the Ansar Allah, where you hear Trump saying it's Iran that's directing the Ansar Allah resistance movement. And we know that's not true, of course. I mean, they have diplomatic ties, but at times, even the Ansar Allah government has acted in contradictory ways to the Iranian wishes. For example, when they took over Sana'a, and Iran instructing them to withhold the severity of their blockade on the so-called Israeli state. I was hoping you could maybe just kind of unpack the propaganda in the West regarding that very term, the axis of resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is an excellent point, and I totally agree. And the Iranian officials have also made that very same point that, you know, these groups are allies, but they operate independently. And so if you want to negotiate, you have to negotiate with them directly, including, as you mentioned, Ansar Allah, right? And I'll raise another example. And this example actually goes back to Syria and was actually disadvantageous for the resistance, right? Immediately after October 7th, if you remember, the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah, started on October 8th, started striking the north of occupied Palestine, right? There was discussion that the Syrians should open up a front in the Golan region, right? But Assad refused to do so, right? All this didn't come out until after the coup, and it was actually, I think it was Yemeni sources that put this information out there. But if everything was being run out of Iran, then certainly the Assad government would have opened up a front in the Golan. The reason why they didn't is because Assad was hopeful for the prospect of normalization with the UAE, in particular in the Gulf countries, in order to eventually get the sanctions lifted. That hopefulness proved to backfire for him and the resistance in general, right? And also, again, when Iran like warned Assad in this last summer that the HTS was about to wage an offensive in the north, right? Assad didn't want to do anything about it, right? So again, it shows that like there's independent thought, independent action in the resistance. Of course, there's collaboration and conversations had, right? But it's not like as if Iran is just running things. And you're right, like this notion is a propaganda point. Just like during I don't know, during the Cold War, when there was a liberation struggle in Vietnam or a liberation struggle in Southern Africa or Latin America, it was always the Soviets that were running things, right? One of the justifications for the coup in the 1954 coup in Guatemala was that the Soviets were supporting the Guatemalan government of Arbenz, right? That he was initiating land reforms in Guatemala, and it had to be a Soviet thing, right? And so the U.S. orchestrated a coup in Guatemala. So that narrative is age old. Obviously, it's propaganda, and it's a matter. And I think it's a matter of sort of the work that you all are doing and the work that others are doing. I think is defeating that narrative. The narrative will be defeated primarily sort of in the geopolitical machinations of the region, but also in terms of what's happening in these protests and on the streets and on campuses throughout the country. I think the narrative, less and less people are inclined to believe the U.S. narrative. So hopefully, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Oh, yeah, very, very, very much so. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Jane.
Oh yeah, I want to ask about the role that the oil still plays. in this as well? Is there still as much oil as there was back then? Is that still are the um and have the politics around that and who controls the change?
Yeah, absolutely. The oil issue absolutely plays a major role to this day. The primary target of the maximum pressure campaign was Iran's oil resources. In fact, the second Trump government, the second term, Trump strengthened the maximum pressure campaign, right? Not only to target Iran, like those, like Iran's directly, but also those third-party countries that were trading with Iran, specifically China, right? But not just China, even U.S. allies, companies that are based in countries that are allies with the U.S. have been targeted by sanctions, including companies in the United Arab Emirates, right? And in India. So these are like, the extension of this campaign is a reflection of the fact that oil continues to be a major issue, right? And again, that's Iran, but it's also Venezuela. What the U.S. is doing with Venezuela is, I would say equally as rapacious, right? And equally as aggressive. So, it's unfortunate, but it also goes to show why, the only way that these countries gain leverage is by showing strength, right? Capitulation will only lead to more and more demands by the U.S. and its allies, right? Showing strength is what brings the U.S. to the bargaining table, and this has also been shown in Gaza, I would argue. So,
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
And expanding off from oil, there's also the minerals as well, and also including the recent lithium battery boom. The whole war in Ukraine has absolutely nothing to do with upholding sovereignty and democracy. One, it's to stop NATO's westward expansion towards Russia's borders, and two, it's a proxy war over who gets to control the vast mineral wealth in the Donbass and Luhansk regions and Ukraine. Ukraine is the richest country in mainland Europe. It's rich in lithium, tungsten, platinum, palladium, tantalum, and there's also cobalt and some other resources as well. And the U.S. is using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder in the war against Russia. And Russia has, over the last 3 years, has strengthened.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't disagree.
Contrary to the reports, and all these wars in the Middle East, as soon as we start peeling back the sheets, like you have done, Professor Navid, it's all about the resources or over who gets to control it.
Yes, and I would also add that resistance, right? Resistance disrupts business as usual, right? Which is why the U.S. is very much inclined to tone things down in the region because they want to resume business, for example, in the Red Sea. They want to resume business in the region, and they want to be able to refocus on China. But yeah, everything you said is correct for sure. And I would also add that I believe Iran actually recently struck lithium as well. So
I remember reading some reports about that, and I've also came across some reports a while ago about Afghanistan that the Afghan government back in the 1980s, 1990s found rich reserves of lithium in there. It's also rich in gold and silver as well.
yeah, I didn't know that about Afghanistan, but I wouldn't be surprised for sure.
Well, considering the kind of mountains and hills they have there.
Yes.
Thank you, Jordan.
Yes.
We might have time probably for one, maybe two more questions. Probably one, I would guess. Anyone else?
Yeah, well,
Is that
Yeah.
Robin?
yeah,
Hi, Robin?
yeah. Mine is more a couple of sort of announcements. One was that Rogani, who was on this call for a while and I think got called away again. She is an Iranian person, and she is planning a delegation to Iran and wants to start a Women's International League for Peace and Freedom section in Iran. This hasn't happened for a long time, so we're really thrilled about that. And she seems determined to do it. She has some of the resources to make it happen. So if anyone's interested, I think she's thinking about this in a month or so. And men are invited and women too. So contact me. I don't have her email right in front of me, but robinloyd8@gmail, you can see my name there, LLOYD number 8@gmail. And I will forward you to Nuri. And secondly, there is a whole discussion on Iran tomorrow about the Iran war, how to stop it, something like that. Have any of you been looking at that?
Is that the one with Moji, Robin?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, could you send both of those links in the chat?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, we do have time for one more question for sure.
Thank you so much for the incredible details of the history that you have been telling us tonight. And you had to skip over large parts of the narrative. I know, like, for example, I didn't hear you say anything about the White Revolution
Oh, yeah.
in Iran. Yeah, that abominable, what an abominable title for something that was wiping out all the indigenous cultures of that country. I I happened to be in that country at that time. I was witnessing that, and it was appalling to me. And I know how much resistance there was among the intelligentsia, among so many Iranians, to this takeover of the entire economy by oil. Yeah. Have you written about the white revolution in
So
your book? Have you?
So, yeah, one of my book chapters looks at both the coups in Iran and Guatemala in 53 and 54. I'm currently writing that chapter, and I'm also going to include a section on the White Revolution. I'm really glad you brought it up because that was sort of like this. The White Revolution was a reflection of the U.S. and the West sort of liberal reaction to the revolutionary movements, like in Cuba, for example. A sort of liberal, sort of quote unquote modernizing attempt that actually was superficial in nature, and as you
Yes,
pointed out, was actually harmful to the people on the ground. Yeah,
yes,
I'm really glad you brought that up. And at the time, it was so heavily supported by the Kennedy government, right? So again, yeah.
yes, yes. And and the rest of the governments. And do you remember at the time in Persepolis when all the heads of state were there to celebrate the idea that the Shah was actually descended from Cyrus the Great?
Yes, yeah,
And they were all agreeing on that. It was,
right,
just abominable. Yeah.
right. And I should point out for those who might not know, the White Revolution, the quote unquote White Revolution, represented a so-called attempt at land reform in Iran by the Shah, initiated by the Shah, supported by the United States, by Washington, including counterinsurgency experts and sort of quote unquote modernization theorists, as a way to combat
Yes.
the potential for actual real revolution. Yeah. So the White
Yes,
Revolution was more
exactly.
counter-revolution than actual revolution.
Well, it prepared the ground for the actual revolution that happened
That's right.
later, and it was obviously so inevitable because the
Yes.
pressure was on the people so intensely.
Yes.
Economic pressure, cultural pressure. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So unless we have one more quick question, I think we should wrap, but Navid, that was yeah, I mean, I think we have a real picture of where we're at, and I think we have a better understanding of the effect of our work, and where we need to emphasize, and and I've, you know, it's helped sharpen my perspective about how we are making a difference, and I've seen that with our, you know, 5 towns pledged to divest in Vermont, which is huge, but I think the overall education also comes into sharper view, I think, because it's all connected, and if you see the U.S. empire in Palestine, you see what it's capable of, and you see the need to prevent, you know, things that could be not even more devastating for a certain people, but even more devastating for the region. And so thank you for that.
Absolutely. Can I wrap up with a few words if possible?
Sure. Sure.
Yeah, so I just want to end by citing a quote from Antonio Gramsci, Italian theorist and revolutionary. This quote I actually shared with my students earlier today, and I want to share with you all as well. And the quote is, he said, the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born, now is the time of monsters, right? And I think that quote, which he said in the 1920s, is really even more applicable now. The old world is dying, new world is struggling to be born, now is the time of monsters. But it reflects, yes, there's extreme violence and repression going on right now, but it's easy to be, when you're in the thick of it, to lose sight of the reality that a new world is coming, and there is hope on the horizon. And I think all of us should maintain that vision and maintain that hope, because I think a better world is ahead. It's just a matter of working toward it. So
I agree.
Thank you. That's great. Yes,
But
that's
what
great.
about the monsters? How do we deal with
Yeah.
They're here.
Fight!
They're here.
Fight!
Yes. And free Palestine. All
What
right.
about Palestina?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Slava Palestina.
We'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Be well,
Thank you all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Give us
Thank you.
take care of